Hi everyone, welcome to Crime Stories to Sleep. I know you can't sleep, so I'll accompany you with crime stories that happened all over the world. Before we get to the story, tell me, where did you hear it from? And if you like this content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the story. A husband and wife took their infant daughter on a trip into the towering redwood forests, but the family disappeared without a trace. An exhaustive search turned up nothing, and the case fell into a 4-year silence, becoming another tragic local legend, until a team of botany students documented a strange growth at the base of a tree, a finding that would unravel a horrific truth hidden just beneath the surface. The calls to Alara Thorne's cell phone began not with panic, but with mild irritation. It was late August 2013, and Adelia Haddon expected her daughter to have checked in hours ago. Alara, 32, her husband, Kaylin Vane, 33, and their 6-month-old daughter, Leela, were due back from a 3-day trip exploring the towering groves of the sequoia-dendron wilderness on the northwest coast. They were experienced travelers, Kaylin especially, and the itinerary was supposed to be relaxed, with easy trails suitable for a baby in a carrier. Yet the evening wore on and the scheduled call never came. Adelia tried Alara's phone again. It went straight to voicemail. She tried Kaylin's. The same result. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in Adelia's chest. This wasn't like them. Even when traveling in areas with patchy reception, they always found a way to send a text or make a brief call, prioritizing communication precisely because they had Leela with them. The silence stretching from the remote northern coast felt heavy and unnatural. By the following morning, the irritation had fully calcified into fear. Adelia Haddon contacted the local police department, explaining that her daughter and son-in-law were significantly overdue and unreachable. The report was taken and the information was relayed to the authorities managing the jurisdiction covering the vast expanse of the sequoia-dendron parks. Investigators began the preliminary steps of tracing the family's movements. They learned that Kaylin and Alara were a vibrant, active couple. Kaylin worked in environmental consulting and possessed a deep knowledge of wilderness safety and navigation. Alara, a graphic designer, was more cautious by nature, especially since Leela's birth, but trusted Kaylin's expertise implicitly. Their trip was meant to be an introduction for Leela to the ancient forests. Kaylin's beloved itinerary was casual, focusing on the most accessible scenic routes and well-maintained trails. They had not packed a satellite phone, assuming it was unnecessary for such casual hikes. The first concrete piece of information came from the digital realm. Recognizing that the couple likely took photos, investigators requested access to their cloud storage accounts. In 2013, automatic uploads depended entirely on finding a signal. As investigators combed through the recent activity, they found something. A single photograph had synced 2 days prior, time-stamped around midday. The image instantly became the centerpiece of the investigation. It showed Kaylin, Alara, and Leela standing on a wide, light brown dirt trail, dwarfed by the immense straight trunks of the sequoias surrounding them. The lighting was soft, filtered by the dense canopy high above. Kaylin, recognizable by his shaved head and light beard, was smiling broadly. He wore a muted green t-shirt and beige shorts, the straps of a backpack visible over his shoulders. Strapped to his chest in a dark grey carrier was Leela, her face turned toward the camera, adorned with a distinctive pink headband featuring a small bow. To his right stood Alara, her long dark hair framing a warm smile. She was dressed in a vibrant blue t-shirt and dark blue leggings, a matching blue fanny pack slung around her waist. Her arm was wrapped around Kaylin's back, her other hand resting protectively on the baby carrier. It was a picture of idyllic happiness, but in the context of their disappearance, it felt haunting. Metadata embedded in the file confirmed the location near a popular scenic route within the park system. Analyzing the angle and framing of the shot, investigators quickly concluded that the photo was not a selfie. The perspective suggested the phone had been handed to a third party, another hiker who happened upon them. This realization presented 2 immediate imperatives: locate the physical starting point of their hike and identify the person who took the picture. The first task was straightforward. Utilizing the location data, park rangers quickly located the trailhead corresponding to the photo. There, parked neatly in the designated area, was the family's vehicle. It was locked, undisturbed, and showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. The presence of the car suggested they had embarked on their hike as planned and intended to return, but they never did. The Vane Thorn family had seemingly stepped onto that trail and vanished into the ancient forest. The discovery of the vehicle mobilized a massive response. The sequoia-dendron wilderness is not just a collection of trees. It is a sprawling, complex ecosystem covering over 139,000 acres. The terrain is characterized by steep ravines, dense undergrowth, and trees so massive they create a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. For search and rescue teams, it is one of the most challenging environments in North America. The initial strategy was saturation. Dozens of professional searchers, K9 units, and volunteers were deployed, starting from the trailhead and fanning outwards. The difficulty of the operation became immediately apparent. The dense canopy hundreds of feet high rendered aerial searches by helicopter nearly useless, obscuring any view of the ground. On the ground, visibility was often limited to mere yards. The forest floor, carpeted with centuries of fallen needles and debris, made tracking footprints incredibly difficult, even for experienced trackers. Adelia Haddon arrived at the hastily established command center near the trailhead. The agonizing uncertainty was etched on her face. She, along with Kaylin's family, provided investigators with critical details about the couple's gear, their hiking habits, and their personalities. Adelia was adamant that Kaylin, despite his adventurous spirit, was meticulous when it came to safety. He would never, she insisted, take reckless risks with Alara, and especially not with 6-month-old Leela. She described the specific brand of the baby carrier, the color of the blanket they always kept with Leela, and the contents of the backpack Kaylin was likely carrying. Standard day hike supplies, water, snacks, a basic first aid kit, but nothing intended for overnight survival. The search continued for days, then weeks. Teams meticulously covered the main trail where the photo was taken, pushing miles in every direction. They also began the arduous process of searching off trail areas, battling thickets of huckleberry and massive ferns. The scale of the environment was overwhelming. It was entirely possible for a person to be just 50 feet off the trail and remain completely invisible. Despite the exhaustive efforts, the search yielded nothing. No dropped water bottle, no fibers from clothing caught on a branch, no sign of a struggle, no discarded diaper. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed them whole. Investigators turned their attention back to the only witness they knew existed, the photographer. The hope was that this individual might remember which direction the family headed after the photo was taken, or perhaps recall something unusual about their demeanor. Identifying a random hiker in a popular tourist destination was a formidable task. Investigators circulated the image, hoping the person might recognize themselves or that someone else might identify the family and recall seeing the interaction. Weeks into the investigation, the breakthrough came. The individual was identified as a tourist from a foreign country who had already returned home. Through international cooperation, authorities contacted him. The man vividly recalled the encounter. He remembered the happy couple and the baby with the pink headband. He offered to take the photo, and then they parted ways. Crucially, he stated that the family continued down the main established trail. He saw nothing suspicious, no one following them, nothing out of the ordinary. The lead, which had seemed so promising, evaporated into mundane reality. As the physical search stalled, investigators began exploring other possibilities. The wilderness holds more dangers than just the elements. A month into the search, a specialized tracking team operating deep in an off-limits, protected section of the park detected signs of recent disturbance. It wasn't related to the missing family, but it was significant. They found evidence of illegal old-growth poaching, a lucrative black market trade involving the cutting and theft of ancient sequoia burls. This discovery introduced a new, sinister theory. The area where the poaching activity was detected was remote, but theoretically accessible from the area where the family vanished. Investigators considered the possibility that Kaylin and Alara had inadvertently ventured off-trail and stumbled upon an illegal operation in progress. Timber poachers were known to be territorial and potentially dangerous. Could the family have been silenced to protect the criminal enterprise? For several weeks, this theory gained traction. It provided a plausible explanation for the complete absence of evidence, a deliberate effort to conceal a crime. Detectives began investigating local timber black markets, looking for informants and recent movements of high-value wood. They interviewed known associates of poaching rings in the region. However, the investigation found no correlation. The timing didn't align perfectly, and informants within the poaching community, when pressed, offered nothing connecting their activities to the disappearance of a family. The theory, like the physical search, hit a dead end. After 2 months, the relentless pace of the search operation became unsustainable. The weather began to turn, and the resources required were immense. With no new leads and the probability of survival diminishing, the active search was officially scaled back. The case remained open, intensely scrutinized by Adelia Haddon, but the initial urgency faded. The disappearance of the Vane Thorn family became another tragic mystery held by the silent, ancient woods. The trail had gone completely cold. The narrative jumps forward 4 years to the summer of 2017. The memory of the missing family had begun to fade from the public consciousness. Though Adelia Haddon continued to press authorities for answers, the forest, meanwhile, continued its slow, inexorable cycle of growth and decay. That summer, a small group of graduate students specializing in botany from a university in another state was conducting intensive field research within the sequoia-dendron wilderness. They were led by Dorian Zephyr, a meticulous researcher focused on the impact of recent localized wildfires on plant regrowth patterns. Their research permits granted them access to remote, rarely accessed sectors of the park, miles away from the popular trails and significantly distant from the area where Kaylin, Alara, and Leela had vanished. Their presence deep in this rugged terrain was entirely legitimate, driven by scientific inquiry. The group had been hiking for several hours, navigating steep slopes and dense undergrowth, moving between their established research grids. The air was damp and cool beneath the canopy, the silence broken only by the sound of their own movements. By early afternoon, they decided to take a break near a large, aging oak tree situated in a small clearing amidst the towering sequoias. Oak trees were less common in this specific area, making it a notable landmark for their research. As they settled down, shedding their heavy packs and retrieving their lunches, Dorian Zephyr noticed something unusual at the base of the oak. His eyes, trained to spot subtle variations in the forest floor ecology, were drawn to a bizarre amorphous mass nestled against the tree's roots. It was unlike anything he had encountered in his years of fieldwork. The growth was large, perhaps 3 feet across, and startlingly colored. It was a chaotic mix of bright, sulfurous yellow and stark white with patches of deep, oily black that looked as if soil or decaying matter had been incorporated into the structure. The texture was lumpy, porous, and wet-looking, almost resembling chemical foam that had been spilled and solidified rather than a natural plant growth. It looked alien against the dark, damp earth and the reddish-brown bark of the tree. Curiosity piqued. Zephyr stood up and approached the mass. As he drew closer, the visual strangeness was accompanied by a distinct, unsettling odor. The forest floor usually smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and the sweet scent of decay. But this was different. It was a sharp, pungent, and deeply putrid smell that cut through the ambient forest air. It was the unmistakable smell of advanced decomposition, but amplified and concentrated. Zephyr called the other students over. They were equally fascinated and repulsed. They spent several minutes examining the growth, discussing its potential origins. Was it a massive slime mold? A reaction to some environmental toxin? They took numerous high-resolution photographs documenting the mass from every angle, capturing the strange coloration and texture against the backdrop of the forest floor. After thoroughly documenting the anomaly, the group shouldered their packs and continued on to their next research grid, the strange encounter lingering in their minds. That evening, back at a remote research outpost station maintained by the Park Service, the group was reviewing their findings. They showed the photographs to a resident park botanist who was stationed there for the season. The botanist was stunned by the images. He remarked on the sheer size and the vibrant, unnatural coloration. Based on the visual evidence and Zephyr's description of the intense odor, the botanist offered a hypothesis. The growth was likely the result of decomposition gases from a large, buried animal, perhaps a bear or an elk, fueling an extreme, localized plant bloom. The nutrients released during decomposition, combined with specific environmental conditions, could create such an anomaly. This explanation resonated with the group. If a large animal carcass was indeed buried there, the decomposition process and its impact on the surrounding plant ecology presented a unique research opportunity. It was a chance to document a rarely observed phenomenon. Driven by this scientific curiosity, Zephyr and his team decided to return to the site the next day. They equipped themselves with sampling tools, core samplers, and the compact survival shovels they carried for field work. The hike back to the oak tree was focused and swift. When they arrived, the fungal mass was unchanged, the pungent odor hanging heavily in the air. They began their work methodically. The plan was to take soil samples from around the mass and then carefully excavate a small section to determine the source of the nutrients. Zephyr began digging at the edge of the growth. The soil was loose, making the initial digging easy. As he dug deeper, the stench intensified rapidly, becoming almost overwhelming. They had to take turns digging, the odor forcing them to step back for fresh air. A few feet down, Zephyr's shovel struck something resilient. It wasn't the resistance of a root or a rock, but something that yielded slightly under the pressure. He cleared the loose dirt away. It was a sheet of heavy-duty black plastic. It wasn't a natural part of the forest floor. The realization that this was not a buried animal hit the group instantly. The atmosphere shifted from scientific curiosity to apprehension. They continued digging, now with a sense of urgency. They uncovered more of the plastic, realizing it was a large tarp. It appeared to be layered multiple times, suggesting a deliberate effort to seal whatever was inside. The implications were ominous. This was a clandestine burial. Working together, they managed to clear enough dirt to expose a significant section of the tarp. Using a field knife, Zephyr carefully cut through the layers of plastic. The moment the seal was broken, the concentrated odor of decomposition rushed out. Peering into the opening, they saw not the fur of an animal, but the heavily decomposed remains of a human adult. The discovery was jarring. The students immediately stopped the excavation. The reality of their situation, deep in the wilderness, standing over a hidden grave, was overwhelming. Zephyr retrieved the satellite phone from his pack and, with shaking hands, contacted the authorities, reporting the discovery of human remains in one of the most remote sections of the park. The coordinates provided by Dorian Zephyr directed authorities to a location far from any established trail system. The logistical challenge of reaching the site was significant. A specialized forensic team had to be airlifted as close as possible and then hiked for several hours through the rugged terrain, carrying heavy equipment. The isolation that had kept the grave hidden for years now complicated the investigation. When the team arrived, they found the scene exactly as the students had described it. The bizarre, vibrant plant growth contrasting sharply with the disturbed earth and the exposed section of black tarp. The students who had remained nearby as instructed were interviewed by the initial responding officers. They recounted the discovery, emphasizing the scientific curiosity that led them to dig and the shock of finding human remains. The forensic team began the meticulous process of securing the scene. The remote location required them to establish a perimeter and work under field conditions, battling the damp environment and the overwhelming odor emanating from the grave. The excavation was slow and methodical. Every layer of soil was sifted, every piece of potential evidence catalogued. The strange plant growth was carefully documented and sampled, recognized as a byproduct of the decomposition process occurring beneath it. The excavation revealed the full extent of the burial. The body was tightly wrapped in multiple layers of heavy-duty black tarp, sealed with a thoroughness that suggested time and deliberation. This was not a hasty burial. It was a calculated disposal. After several hours of painstaking work, the body, still encased in the tarp, was removed from the grave and prepared for transport to the medical examiner's office. The initial assessment at the scene confirmed the remains were those of an adult male, but the identity remained unknown. The news of the discovery rippled through the region, reaching Adelia Haddon. The discovery of a body in the sequoias inevitably raised the painful possibility that it might be connected to the disappearance of her family 4 years earlier. The uncertainty was agonizing. At the medical examiner's office, the process of identification began. The advanced state of decomposition made visual identification impossible. The remains were largely skeletonized with some preserved tissue remaining within the anaerobic environment created by the tarp. Dental records were requested for all long-term missing persons associated with the area, including Kaylin Vane. The comparison yielded a definitive match. The remains were confirmed to be those of Caelan Vane. 4 years after he vanished, Caelan had been found. The discovery was a devastating blow to his family and to Adelia Haddon. It confirmed their worst fears, but also shattered the previous theories about the family getting lost or falling victim to the elements. Caelan had been deliberately buried, hidden deep in the wilderness. This strongly suggested foul play was involved, at least in the disposal of his body. But the discovery raised a terrifying new question. Where were Alara and Leela? The grave contained only Caelan's remains. There was no sign of his wife or their baby daughter. The mystery deepened, taking a darker turn. The autopsy commenced, presenting significant challenges due to the condition of the remains. The medical examiner meticulously examined the skeleton for any signs of trauma. There were no gunshot wounds, no evidence of stabbing, no fractures indicative of blunt force trauma. The hyoid bone was intact. The cause of death was initially undetermined. This paradox was baffling. The clandestine burial strongly suggested concealment. Yet, the remains showed no signs of violence. How did Caelan die? And why would someone go to such lengths to hide his body if the death was accidental or natural? Investigators were left with a scenario that made little sense. If Caelan had died accidentally, why didn't Alara seek help? If she was involved in the burial, it seemed physically impossible for her to have dug the grave herself, especially while caring for a 6-month-old baby. Furthermore, where would she have obtained heavy-duty black tarp in the middle of the wilderness? The evidence pointed towards the involvement of a third party, but the lack of trauma on Caelan's body complicated the narrative of a violent abduction. Faced with the absence of a clear cause of death, the medical examiner ordered specialized toxicological screening. This was a complex and time-consuming process involving the analysis of bone marrow and the decomposition fluids that had been trapped within the tarp. These fluids, essentially a concentrated byproduct of the body's breakdown, might hold chemical clues that had been preserved. Weeks later, the results came back, and they were startling. The analysis detected highly concentrated compounds of rattlesnake venom. The levels were significant, suggesting a severe envenomation shortly before death. The revelation was shocking. Rattlesnakes, while present on the northwest coast, are exceedingly rare in the deep shade and cool temperatures of the sequoia forests. They prefer drier, warmer environments. Investigators consulted with herpetologists who confirmed that while not impossible, a fatal encounter in this specific ecosystem was highly unusual. The snakebite explanation offered a plausible cause of death that aligned with the lack of trauma on the remains. The working theory shifted dramatically. Investigators hypothesized that Caelan might have been bitten by a rattlesnake while hiking. Given the potency of the venom and their remote location, the bite could have been fatal within hours. But this theory still failed to explain the burial or the disappearance of Alara and Leela. If Caelan died from a snakebite, what happened next? The discovery of the venom provided a partial answer to how Caelan died, but it intensified the mystery surrounding the fate of his wife and child. The investigation shifted dramatically. The snakebite explained Caelan's death, but it strongly suggested the involvement of a third party in the aftermath. Someone else had been there. Someone else had access to the tarp. Someone else had buried Caelan. The investigation was no longer just about finding missing hikers. It was about reconstructing a complex and terrifying sequence of events that began with a fatal encounter with a snake and ended with a hidden grave. With the realization that a third party was involved in the burial of Caelan Vane, the investigation turned its focus to the physical evidence found at the gravesite. The remote location, while initially a hindrance, now became a crucial element of the investigation. Someone had chosen that spot deliberately. Forensic teams analyzed the documentation of the burial site. The excavation had revealed that the burial was not rushed. The grave was dug with care, deep enough to avoid easy discovery by animals or casual observation. The body was wrapped methodically in the tarp, suggesting the person involved had time and was not panicked. This indicated that the burial likely occurred shortly after Caelan's death by someone who felt secure in that location. The most significant piece of evidence was the black tarp itself. It was the one element that didn't belong in the wilderness, the one thing that connected the grave to the outside world. The layers of plastic were analyzed meticulously for trace evidence. In the environment of the grave, the tarp had acted as a barrier, preserving not only the decomposition fluids, but also any particles that might have been adhered to it before the burial. The forensic analysis of the tarp yielded specific and unusual trace evidence embedded in the fibers of the plastic and mixed with the soil found on the outer layers. Investigators found microscopic particles of a specific type of volcanic rock dust. This geological signature was significant, as volcanic soil deposits were localized within the vast expanse of the region and not present at the burial site itself. The volcanic dust suggested the tarp had been stored or used in a location with a different soil composition. In addition to the dust, the analysis detected traces of aged diesel fuel. The presence of diesel suggested the tarp might have been associated with machinery, vehicles, or a storage area where fuel was kept. These two elements, volcanic dust and diesel fuel, provided the first tangible clues about the origin of the tarp. Investigators also focused on the material of the tarp itself. It was identified as a specific grade of high durability, UV-resistant plastic, not the typical lightweight material sold in camping stores. This was industrial-grade material used primarily for heavy equipment covering construction sites or agricultural use. The investigators began the painstaking process of tracing the manufacturing and distribution of this specific type of tarp. They discovered that this particular batch, identified by its chemical composition and texture, was sold only through a few specialized rural supply outlets in the surrounding counties. The investigation now had three distinct vectors: the geographic distribution of the volcanic soil, the locations where diesel fuel might be present, and the outlets that sold the specific tarp. The challenge was to find the intersection of these three elements. A massive mapping project was initiated. Investigators began by mapping the geological surveys of the region, identifying areas characterized by the specific volcanic soil deposits found on the tarp. They then cross-referenced this information with satellite imagery and decades-old property records. They were looking for remote properties, homesteads, or industrial sites located within a drivable radius of the burial site. The presence of diesel suggested they should focus on properties with vehicles or heavy equipment, particularly those accessible via old logging roads or unmaintained tracks. This was not a quick process. The region surrounding the sequoia dendron wilderness is sparsely populated, characterized by isolated homesteads, old logging camps, and properties whose owners valued privacy and seclusion. The mapping project generated dozens of potential locations that matched at least some of the criteria. While the forensic and geographical analysis continued, the human element of the tragedy remained central. Adelia Haddon had to process the discovery of Kalen's remains and the bizarre cause of death. The confirmation of his death was devastating, ending 4 years of uncertainty, but confirming her worst fears. The explanation of the snakebite provided little comfort. To Adelia, the fact that Kalen had been buried secretly only reinforced her belief that something terrible had happened to Alara and Leela. If Kalen's death was an accident, why hadn't the person who buried him come forward? Why hadn't they helped Alara and Leela? The investigation was now operating under the assumption that Alara and Leela might still be alive, perhaps held captive, or that they had been murdered and disposed of separately. The pressure to identify the origin of the tarp was immense. The painstaking work of the mapping project was narrowing the field, moving the investigation from the vast wilderness to the isolated pockets of human habitation hidden within it. The intersection of the volcanic dust, the diesel fuel, and the agricultural tarp was leading investigators toward a specific area, a place where the secrets of the past 4 years might be hidden. The mapping project, integrating geological data, trace evidence analysis, and supply chain information, began to yield actionable intelligence. The dozens of isolated properties identified were prioritized based on how closely they matched the profile derived from the evidence. Investigators began the systematic process of visiting these locations. Given the sensitive nature of the investigation and the independent, often suspicious nature of the residents in these remote areas, the approach had to be cautious. They couldn't simply arrive and start asking questions about a 4-year-old disappearance and a hidden grave. The investigators often operated under the pretext of routine fire safety compliance checks or illegal cultivation surveys, common reasons for law enforcement presence in the region. This allowed them to assess the residents, observe the premises, and look for the specific elements identified in the investigation without raising suspicion. They visited old logging camps, isolated cabins, and off-grid homesteads. At each location, they looked for rolls of the specific black agricultural tarp, signs of heavy equipment, and the presence of diesel storage. They also took discrete soil samples for comparison with the volcanic dust found at the grave. The investigation eventually focused on a property situated about 8 miles from Kalen's grave. This property was located in an area characterized by the specific volcanic soil identified in the forensic analysis. It was accessible only via a rough, unmaintained track that cut through the dense forest, making it extremely isolated. The property was owned by Torin Yarrow, a man in his late 50s. Local records indicated that Yarrow lived alone and had owned the property for decades. Interviews with locals in the nearest small town painted a picture of Yarrow as an eccentric and sometimes volatile recluse. He was known to live entirely off-grid, rarely coming into town for supplies, and fiercely protective of his privacy. 2 detectives were assigned to conduct the initial visit to Yarrow's homestead. The drive itself was challenging, the unmaintained track requiring a high-clearance vehicle. As they approached the property, the sense of isolation was profound. The homestead was a collection of structures built over time, a main cabin, several outbuildings, and sheds. The property was cluttered with old machinery, rusting vehicles, and various debris. It had an unkempt, almost feral atmosphere. The detectives approached the main cabin and announced their presence. Torin Yarrow emerged. He was a weathered man dressed in worn work clothes, his expression immediately defensive and hostile. He questioned the detectives' presence on his property, demanding to know why they were there. The detectives stuck to their pretext of a fire safety compliance check, explaining they were surveying all properties in the area due to the high fire risk. Yarrow was uncooperative, answering questions with monosyllabic replies and complaining about government intrusion. While one detective engaged Yarrow in conversation, the other carefully observed the surroundings. The ground around the homestead was characterized by the distinctive reddish-brown volcanic soil. Then the detectives spotted what they were looking for. Near one of the larger outbuildings, there was a dilapidated tractor partially covered by a large sheet of black plastic. The material appeared identical in texture and weight to the tarp found at the grave. Nearby, there was an old diesel tank stained with years of use. Several large rolls of the same black tarp were stacked against the side of the shed. The presence of the matching tarp, the diesel residue from the tank and the tractor, and the soil composition aligning perfectly with the trace evidence found at the grave provided the investigators with the probable cause they needed. They concluded the interview with Yarrow, apologizing for the intrusion, and left the property. As soon as they were out of sight, they reported their findings to the command center. The decision was made to secure a search warrant for the entire property. Given Yarrow's volatility and the remote location, the execution of the warrant had to be carefully planned. Investigators monitored the property covertly for the next 48 hours using long-range observation and aerial surveillance to confirm that Yarrow remained on the property and lived alone. They needed to ensure there were no other individuals present who might complicate the operation. The search warrant was granted. A tactical team was assembled. The plan was to execute the warrant early in the morning, utilizing the element of surprise to detain Yarrow before he had a chance to react or destroy evidence. The raid commenced before dawn. The tactical team moved quickly and quietly down the long track leading to the homestead. They converged on the property simultaneously from multiple directions, securing the perimeter and approaching the main cabin. The element of surprise was crucial. They breached the cabin door and found Yarrow inside. He was detained without incident, seemingly resigned to the inevitability of the situation. He was secured in handcuffs and removed from the cabin while the search began. The extensive search of the property commenced immediately. The forensic teams began processing the area where the tarp and the tractor were located, taking samples for definitive comparison with the evidence from the grave. The search of the main cabin began. The interior was disorganized, cluttered with years of accumulated possessions, reflecting Yarrow's reclusive lifestyle. The initial search of the living areas yielded nothing immediately connecting him to the missing family. There were no obvious signs that Alara or Leela had ever been in the cabin. The search continued for hours, expanding to the outbuildings and the surrounding area. The investigators were looking for any trace of the missing woman and child, clothing, personal belongings, or grimly, other burial sites. The homestead was large, and the clutter made the search slow and difficult. The anticipation was high, the investigators certain they were in the right place, but the lack of immediate discovery of further evidence began to create a tense atmosphere. The question lingered: if this was where the tarp originated, what else was hidden here? The search of Torin Yarrow's property stretched into the afternoon. The forensic teams had confirmed that the black tarp found near the tractor was an exact match to the material used to wrap Kaylin Vane's body. The soil samples taken from the homestead also matched the volcanic dust found at the gravesite. The evidence connecting Yarrow to the burial was overwhelming. Yet, the central mystery remained. Where were Alara and Leela? The search teams had meticulously gone through the outbuildings, finding nothing but old tools, supplies, and more debris. The surrounding area had been surveyed for any signs of disturbed soil that might indicate other graves, with negative results. The focus returned to the main cabin. The investigators began a more intrusive search of the structure itself, looking for hidden compartments or anomalies. It was late in the afternoon when an investigator noticed an irregularity in the flooring of the main cabin. The wooden planks in a corner of the kitchen area seemed slightly raised, and the spacing between them was uneven. They pulled back a worn rug that covered the area. Beneath it, they discovered a distinct outline in the flooring, a hidden access panel. It was secured with screws that appeared to have been removed and replaced multiple times. The access panel was carefully removed, revealing a dark opening leading beneath the cabin. A ladder descended into the darkness. The air rising from the opening was cold, damp, and carried the faint, unsettling odor of mildew and something else, something familiar from the excavation of Kaylin's grave. With weapons drawn, the investigators descended into the opening. It led to a small, cold-root cellar dug directly into the earth beneath the structure. The space was cramped, the ceiling low, the walls lined with rough wooden shelves holding jars of preserved food. The light from their flashlights cut through the gloom. In the far corner of the cellar, the forensic team made a horrific discovery. Partially buried in the dirt floor, concealed under a pile of old burlap sacks, were human remains. The decomposition was advanced, mostly skeletal. The excavation began immediately, the small space making the process even more difficult than the recovery of Kaylin's body. The remains were identified quickly. The clothing fragments found with the body matched the description of what Alara Thorne was wearing when she disappeared. Dental records later confirmed the identification. Alara had been found. The discovery of Alara's body confirmed the darkest theories of the investigation. The examination of the scene in the root cellar indicated a violent end. There was evidence suggesting she had been restrained. The autopsy later confirmed the cause of death. The hyoid bone was fractured, indicating she had died from strangulation. The discovery of Alara's body answered one question, but intensified the urgency of another. What happened to baby Leela? There was no sign of the infant's remains in the root cellar or anywhere else on the property. However, the investigators found other items in the cellar that connected back to the disappearance. In a corner hidden behind a stack of crates, they found a small, mildewed bag. Inside, they discovered the blue fanny pack that Alara was seen wearing in the last photo. It still contained her wallet and identification. Along with the fanny pack, they found a small bundle of baby clothing and a distinct handcrafted blanket. The items confirmed that Leela had also been at the homestead. Torin Yarrow was formally arrested and transported to the county jail. He had remained silent throughout the search, his expression inscrutable. Now confronted with the discovery of Alara's remains on his property and the evidence connecting him to Kaylin's burial, the interrogation began. The interrogation room was small and sterile, a stark contrast to the chaotic environment of Yarrow's homestead. The detectives presented the evidence methodically, laying out the connection between the tarp, the soil, and the bodies. Yarrow initially denied any knowledge of the disappearance, claiming the remains must have been there before he owned the property, a claim easily disproven by the timeline. The interrogation continued for hours. The detectives pressed on Yarrow, emphasizing the gravity of the situation and the inevitability of his conviction. Eventually, his stoic demeanor began to crack. The weight of the evidence and the isolation of the interrogation room broke through his defenses. He began to talk. Over the next several hours, Torin Yarrow confessed, providing a detailed account of the events that transpired in August 2013. His story was a chilling narrative of a tragic accident followed by opportunistic violence. According to Yarrow, late in the evening on the day the family disappeared, he was in his cabin, heavily intoxicated. He heard a noise outside, a frantic shouting. He went to investigate and found a woman stumbling onto his property. It was Alara. She was carrying a baby, Leela. She was lost, hysterical, and desperate for help. Alara explained that they had been hiking and decided to go off trail to find a secluded spot to rest and feed the baby. While they were resting, Kaylin had accidentally sat down on a rattlesnake that was concealed in the undergrowth. The snake had bitten him multiple times. Kaylin had gone into shock rapidly. Alara, inexperienced in the wilderness and terrified, tried to help him, but he quickly became unresponsive. They had no satellite phone and no cell service. Alara realized she needed to find help. She took the baby and started walking, trying to find a trail or a road. She had become disoriented and lost, wandering in the dark for several hours before she stumbled upon Yarrow's homestead. Yarrow claimed that upon hearing her story, he agreed to help. He took his rifle and a flashlight and followed Alara back into the woods. She led him to the area where Kaylin lay. When they arrived, Yarrow checked Kaylin. He was already deceased. The signs of the snakebite were evident, swelling and discoloration around the wounds. It was at this moment, according to Yarrow, that his intentions shifted. He was drunk, isolated, and recognized the opportunity presented by the situation. Alara was alone, lost, and desperate. No one knew where she was. No one would connect her disappearance to his remote property. Instead of using the satellite phone he possessed at his property to call for help, he made a dark decision. He forced Alara and the baby back to his cabin at gunpoint. He held them captive overnight. In his confession, Yarrow admitted to sexually assaulting Alara in the cabin. The root cellar, accessible from inside the cabin, was where he restrained her. The next day, when Yarrow sobered up, he realized the gravity of his actions. He had kidnapped and assaulted a woman. He knew that if he let her go, she would report him to the authorities. He made the decision to cover up his crimes. He murdered Alara in the root cellar, strangling her, and then concealed her body under the dirt floor. With Alara dead, Yarrow then had to deal with Kaylin's body. He took a roll of the black agricultural tarp from his supplies and hiked back to the area where Kaylin lay. He wrapped the body meticulously in the tarp and buried him near where he died, choosing the spot near the oak tree for its isolation. He dug a deep grave to ensure the body would not be discovered. He believed that if the bodies were never found, he would never be caught. Yarrow's confession explained the bizarre circumstances of the case, the snakebite, the clandestine burial, and the disappearance of Alara and Leela. It was a narrative of a tragic accident intersecting with human depravity. The investigation had finally uncovered the truth about what happened to Kaylin and Alara, but one crucial question remained unanswered, hanging heavy in the sterile air of the interrogation room. What happened to the baby? When the detectives pressed Torin Yarrow about the fate of baby Leela, his response was unexpected. He insisted that despite the brutality of his actions against Alara, he couldn't bring himself to harm the infant. He claimed that after the murders, he was left with the 6-month-old baby, unsure of what to do. He didn't want another death on his conscience, but he couldn't keep the child. According to Yarrow, in the days following the murders, he made a drastic decision. He claimed he packed supplies, took the baby, and drove south. He stated he crossed the border into a country to the south and traveled deep into the country to a small town in a specific southern state in that country. There, he relinquished the baby to a local orphanage, providing false information about her identity, claiming she was the child of a relative who could no longer care for her. Investigators were immediately skeptical of this claim. It seemed too convenient, a self-serving attempt to mitigate the monstrosity of his crimes. However, they were obligated to investigate the possibility that Leela might still be alive. They began the complex process of attempting to verify Yarrow's story. They uncovered evidence that supported part of his account. Border crossing data and receipts found at his homestead confirmed that Yarrow did indeed travel deep into a country to the south shortly after the murders in 2013. He had been gone for nearly 2 weeks. Furthermore, the handcrafted blanket found in the root cellar with Leela's clothing was analyzed. It was identified as a style specific to the region of a specific southern state in that country that Yarrow had mentioned. This suggested he might have acquired the blanket during his trip, perhaps intending to leave it with the baby. Despite this corroborating evidence, the trail for Leela in a country to the south was complex. The passage of 4 years, the last time anyone saw the Abbott brothers was on a July afternoon. False information provided by Yarrow made the search exceedingly difficult in their Boy Scout uniforms. International authorities were involved, storm hit, but the efforts to locate the boys would tragically Leela's description yielded no definitive results. That comforted no one yet. Touring the Yarrow was charged with the murders of Alara Thorne, but 11 years later, the clang of a logger's machine hitting a buried shipping container would finally break the case open. He pleaded revealing a sinister truth hidden just beneath the forest life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sky over the state forest was officially closed with Yarrow's conviction. Long before the sun was due to set on July 12, 1997. Their fate was revealed after years of mystery. Situated near the forest's edge, the resolution initially went unnoticed. While there was evidence suggesting that Leela was alive, the absence of two specific voices remained unconfirmed. First registered as wrong. The mystery of what happened to the baby lost in the sequoias lingered. Her son, a final unresolved question in a case defined by tragedy and deception. The boys had spent the afternoon at a scheduled Boy Scout troop meeting, a routine gathering held at a clearing just inside the forest perimeter. The meeting had concluded hours ago. By now, Ethan and Isaac should have been home, shedding their uniforms and demanding snacks. Ethan, the elder, was typically responsible, recognizable in his tan, short-sleeved shirt and dark shorts, his blonde hair neatly parted. Isaac, quieter and more observant, wore the olive-green, long-sleeved variant of the uniform, a unique circular pendant hanging from the red cord around his neck. They were inseparable, bound by more than just brotherhood. They shared an intense curiosity about the sprawling wilderness that began practically at their doorstep. Ms. Davis mentioned their tardiness to her husband, Mr. Anderson. Initially, the concern was mild. Perhaps the meeting ran long, or they had stopped at a friend's house. But as another 30 minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the house began to change, mirroring the rapidly deteriorating weather outside. The wind was picking up significantly, rattling the windows with a low, insistent moan. The forecast had mentioned a chance of rain, but this felt different. It felt heavier, more aggressive. The atmospheric pressure seemed to drop, creating a palpable tension in the air. Mr. Anderson stepped outside. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and the air carried the thick, metallic smell of an imminent downpour. The trees bordering their property were thrashing violently. This wasn't a summer shower. It was a severe, fast-moving storm front. The realization shifted the parents' worry into a sharp, cold panic. If the boys were still out there, they were exposed. They began making calls. First to the scoutmaster. He confirmed the meeting had ended on time around 3:30 p.m. He mentioned having taken a group photo earlier that day, capturing the boys standing formally on a dirt path holding their wide-brimmed hats, a moment of calm before the storm broke. He hadn't seen Ethan or Isaac since the troop dispersed. Calls to other parents yielded the same result. The Abbott brothers had seemingly vanished after the meeting concluded. With the storm now breaking, rain beginning to lash down in horizontal sheets, Ms. Davis and Mr. Anderson made the agonizing decision to contact the local sheriff's department. They officially reported Ethan and Isaac Abbott missing. The words felt surreal, disconnected from the reality of their lives. Authorities arrived quickly, their flashing lights cutting through the deluge, but their ability to act was immediately hampered by the ferocity of the weather. Visibility was near zero, and the noise of the wind and rain made communication difficult. They needed information, a starting point. They began interviewing the other boys from the troop, hoping someone knew where the brothers might have gone. The crucial piece of information came from Leo Prather, a close friend of the brothers. Leo told investigators that Ethan and Isaac had no intention of going straight home. They had a plan. According to Leo, the brothers had recently discovered a hidden cave deep within a less traveled section of the evergreen forest. They were excited about it, treating it as their secret headquarters. They had planned to re-enter the woods immediately after the meeting to spend more time exploring it. Leo hadn't gone with them. He had noticed the sky darkening and the wind rising and decided to head home instead. He recalled urging the Abbott brothers to do the same, but Ethan, emboldened by his recent scouting achievements and the thrill of adventure, had insisted they would be fine. He watched them walk away, disappearing back into the trees while everyone else headed for the parking lot. This revelation provided a destination, but it was a terrifying one. The cave, as described by Leo, was remote, situated miles from the meeting point. If the boys had attempted the hike, they would have been deep in the wilderness when the storm hit its peak. The implications were grim. The authorities hypothesized that the brothers were likely seeking shelter, perhaps in the cave itself, or worse, had suffered an accident in the treacherous conditions. But knowing where they were and reaching them were two different things. The storm was raging with an intensity rarely seen in the region during the summer. The trails were turning into mudslides, and the risk of falling trees made entering the forest a life-threatening endeavor, even for trained personnel. There would be no full-scale search until the weather broke. For Ms. Davis and Mr. Anderson, the night of July 12th was defined by the howling wind and the unbearable weight of waiting. The assumption was that the boys were lost, cold, and fighting for their lives against the elements. The storm raged throughout the night, an unrelenting assault of wind and water that seemed to shake the foundations of the Abbott home. Sleep was impossible. Ms. Davis and Mr. Anderson could only watch the clock and imagine the conditions their sons might be enduring. The evergreen state forest was vast, encompassing thousands of acres of dense woodland, steep ravines, and winding creeks. It was easy to get lost in broad daylight. In the midst of a tempest, it was a death trap. The thought of their sons alone in the darkness, exposed to the fury of the storm, was a constant, agonizing torment. At the first hint of grey light on the morning of July 13th, the search operation mobilized. The scale was massive, involving local law enforcement, state police, park rangers, and hundreds of volunteers from the community. The trailhead parking lot where the Boy Scout meeting had taken place was transformed into a bustling command center. The air was still heavy and wet, but the wind had subsided, allowing the searchers to finally enter the woods. The environment they encountered was unrecognizable. The storm had fundamentally altered the landscape. Trails that had been clear paths the day before were now choked with debris. Ancient trees had been ripped from the earth, their massive root systems exposed like skeletal hands. Creeks that were normally ankle-deep had swollen into raging torrents, carving new paths through the forest floor. The ground itself was a thick, sucking mud that made every step an exertion. The primary focus of the search was the area between the scout meeting point and the location of the cave. Leo Prather, despite his youth and the trauma of the situation, accompanied a team of experienced trackers to guide them toward the secret spot. The journey was arduous. The terrain leading to the cave was naturally rugged, characterized by rocky outcrops and dense underbrush, and the storm damage made it exponentially more difficult to navigate. The searchers worked in organized grid patterns, calling the boys names, the sound swallowed by the dense, wet foliage. They used ropes to cross flooded areas and chainsaws to clear paths. The physical toll was immense. The volunteers, driven by a desperate hope of finding the boys alive, pushed themselves to the brink of exhaustion. The first day of the search yielded nothing. As darkness fell, the teams were forced to retreat, disheartened and frustrated. The temperature dropped, adding the risk of hypothermia to the list of dangers the boys faced if they were still out there. The second day, July 14th, the search resumed with renewed intensity. Specialized teams equipped with climbing gear and mapping technology pushed deeper into the remote areas Leo had indicated. The terrain here was rugged, characterized by steep inclines and rocky outcrops, making the journey even more difficult. It was late in the afternoon on the second day when a breakthrough finally occurred. A search team located a cave matching the description provided by Leo. It was situated in a remote ravine, its entrance partially obscured by a landslide of mud and rock triggered by the heavy rains. The sight of it immediately dampened the spirits of the search party. It was difficult to access, and the surrounding area showed clear signs of violent water movement. Investigators cautiously entered the cave. It was damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. The first priority was to determine if the boys had actually made it this far. The cave floor was covered in a thick layer of fresh silt, making the search for footprints or dropped items nearly impossible. The search seemed to be hitting a dead end until one of the trackers noticed something near the entrance. It wasn't a belonging or a piece of clothing. It was a knot. Tied securely to an exposed root system near the cave opening was a length of red cord identical to the type used in the Boy Scout uniforms. The cord had been fashioned into a complex, intricate knot. It was immediately recognized as a specialized scouting knot, one not typically known by junior members. Leo Prather was brought to the site to examine it. His reaction was immediate. He confirmed that this specific knot, a variation of a friction hitch, was something Ethan Abbott had only recently mastered. Ethan had been intensely proud of this achievement, practicing it incessantly and showing it off to the other scouts. According to Leo, Ethan was likely the only boy in their troop capable of tying it correctly under pressure. The discovery of the knot was pivotal. It strongly suggested that the Abbott brothers had reached their destination shortly before the storm hit its peak. It seemed like a marker, perhaps left by Ethan to signify their arrival or even as a practice exercise while waiting for the rain to start. But why they left the cave or what happened next remained a mystery. The physical evidence inside the cave pointed toward a grim scenario. Along with the silt on the floor, investigators noted debris, leaves, twigs, and mud lodged high on the cave walls, several feet above the heads of the searchers. This was a high watermark, clear evidence that the cave had experienced significant, sudden flooding during the storm. The ravine outside had acted as a funnel, channeling the torrential runoff directly into the opening. The prevailing theory began to solidify, and it was devastating. Authorities believed the boys had been caught in a flash flood within the confines of the cave. The force of the water would have been overwhelming, giving them little chance of escape. The alternative theory was only slightly less horrific. Perhaps they saw the water rising and attempted to flee, only to become hopelessly lost and disoriented in the surrounding wilderness during the height of the storm. The discovery of the knot focused the search efforts, but it did not make the task any easier. The search radius was expanded significantly around the cave area. Divers were brought in to search the swollen creeks and temporary ponds created by the floodwaters. K9 units specialized in tracking and cadaver detection crisscrossed the terrain. The community mobilized with an intensity born of shared grief and the desperate hope of finding the boys alive. Weeks dragged on. The summer heat returned, baking the mud dry and making the air thick and humid. The media attention gradually faded, and the number of volunteers dwindled. The physical toll on the search teams was immense, but the emotional toll was even greater. Despite the most exhaustive search operation in the region's history, no further trace of Ethan or Isaac Abbott was found. No clothing, no equipment, nothing. It was as if the storm had simply washed them away. The absence of any evidence outside the cave reinforced the belief that they had perished in the flood, their bodies perhaps buried under tons of silt or carried miles downstream into inaccessible marshland. The investigation stalled. There were no suspects, no signs of foul play. The knot at the cave entrance was interpreted as the last artifact of a tragic accident. For Ms. Davis and Mr. Anderson, the uncertainty was a torment. They held memorials without bodies, clinging to the faint hope that their sons might one day be found. The case of the Abbott brothers was officially declared cold. It was categorized as a tragic accident, a case of two adventurous boys caught in an unforgiving act of nature. The Evergreen State Forest kept its secrets, and the story of the vanished Boy Scouts became a local legend, a cautionary tale told around campfires. Life in the community moved on, but the scar remained, a wound that refused to heal. 11 years passed. The narrative shifts to October 2008. The Evergreen State Forest remained largely unchanged, a vast expanse of wilderness that resisted human encroachment. The story of the Abbott brothers had faded into local lore, a tragic footnote in the history of the region. However, economic pressures had led the state to open up new, previously inaccessible sections of the forest for logging operations. One such area, located deep within the forest, miles beyond the perimeter of the 1997 search area, was being actively harvested. The noise was deafening. Heavy machinery chewed through the dense woodland. The roar of chainsaws and the grinding gears of skidders echoing through the trees. A logging crew was working against a tight deadline, clearing a tract of land that had been virtually untouched for decades. The work was grueling, the terrain rugged, and the isolation complete. They were deep in the woods, far from any paved road, in an area where cell phone signals were non-existent. Mr. Thompson was operating a feller buncher, a massive machine designed to cut and gather multiple trees simultaneously. He was an experienced logger, accustomed to the rhythms of the forest and the resistance of the earth. But on this particular afternoon, as he cleared a dense patch of underbrush near a natural depression in the terrain, his machine struck something that didn't yield. It wasn't the dull thud of a buried rock or the yielding resistance of a root system. It was the sharp, ringing clang of metal on metal. Mr. Thompson stopped the machine, the engine idling. He climbed down from the cab to investigate. The object was buried beneath a thick layer of topsoil, pine needles, and decaying leaves. It looked like it had been intentionally camouflaged, covered with brush and debris that had accumulated over the years. He kicked at the dirt, exposing a small section of rusted metal. It appeared to be flat, perhaps a sheet of corrugated iron. He called over a couple of his colleagues. They gathered around the discovery, curious and slightly annoyed by the interruption. They helped him clear away the dirt and brush using shovels to gradually reveal the object beneath. It wasn't a sheet of metal. It was a hatch, a large square metal hatch, heavily rusted and pitted with age. It was set into a larger structure that seemed to be buried deep in the earth. The discovery was unsettling. This area was remote, miles from any human habitation. There was no reason for a buried structure to be here. The initial assumption was that it might be an old septic tank or a forgotten root cellar, but the location made no sense. Mr. Thompson tried to lift the hatch. It was heavy, and the hinges were seized with rust. Using a crowbar, the loggers managed to pry it open. The hatch groaned open, revealing a dark, cavernous opening leading down into the earth. A stale, musty smell wafted up from the darkness, the scent of decay, mold, and damp earth. They peered into the opening. They couldn't see much, but the shape of the structure was becoming clear. It wasn't a tank or a cellar. It was a shipping container deliberately buried in the ground. A heated debate broke out among the crew. Mr. Thompson's colleagues urged him to ignore the find. They were already behind schedule, and involving the authorities would mean shutting down the operation, potentially for days. The delay would jeopardize their pay, and their boss was notoriously unforgiving about missed deadlines. They argued that it was probably just an old survivalist bunker or a hunter's cache, and it wasn't their business. "Let's just cover it back up and move on," the foreman insisted. But Mr. Thompson was a father himself. The sight of the buried container, the darkness within, and the deliberate concealment filled him with a profound sense of unease. Something felt deeply wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled upon something sinister. The effort required to bury something this large in such a remote location was significant. It felt hidden. It felt like a secret that needed to be exposed. He made a decision. Ignoring the protests of his crew, he decided to report the discovery. The isolation of the site meant there was no cell service. Mr. Thompson had to drive his truck several miles down the rough logging roads, navigating the treacherous terrain until he reached a main road where he could get a signal. The drive felt agonizingly long, the silence in the truck amplifying his growing dread. He finally reached a spot where his phone showed a signal. He called the county sheriff's office and described what they had found. The sheriff's department, recognizing the unusual nature of the discovery and the remoteness of the location, dispatched deputies to the scene. They arrived hours later, guided by Mr. Thompson. The logging operation was halted. The area was secured, transformed from a worksite into a potential crime scene. The deputies began the process of excavating the area around the container. It was a massive undertaking, requiring the use of the logging equipment to clear the earth that had encased the structure for years. As the dirt was removed, the full scale of the container was revealed. It was a massive shipping container, 40 feet long, buried in a deep trench. The entire visible surface was covered in thick, flaky layers of orange and brown rust. Patches of bright green moss had taken root on its flat top surface, further cementing its age and neglect. The scene was grim. The container sat in the muddy trench, a rusting sarcophagus unearthed from the forest floor. The initial inspection of the exterior suggested that the container had been buried for a very long time. The focus turned to the interior. The hatch was the only visible entrance. Investigators equipped with powerful flashlights and protective gear cautiously climbed down into the darkness. The descent felt like descending into a grave. The interior was a scene of decay and abandonment. It was clearly a makeshift living space, but it had not been occupied for years. The air was thick and foul, difficult to breathe. The flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing a horrific tableau. 2 decaying mattresses lay on the floor, covered in mold and rodent droppings. The floor was littered with debris, empty food wrappers, crushed aluminum cans, and plastic bottles. The packaging styles and brand logos suggested they dated back to the late 1990s or early 2000s. The sheer volume of debris indicated a long-term habitation. It was clear that someone had lived here, perhaps for an extended period, but it was the nature of the items found that shifted the atmosphere from unsettling to horrifying. Scattered among the debris were items that seemed incongruous with an adult survivalist or hunter. They found several comic book issues, their pages warped and stained with moisture, dating from 1997. A portable CD player, heavily corroded and long dead, lay near one of the mattresses with several CDs scattered nearby, bands popular among teenagers in that era. The items suggested young occupants, a realization that sent a chill through the investigative team. The container was searched methodically, every item catalogued and photographed. The conditions were appalling, the environment hazardous due to the mold and rust. The investigators were working under the assumption that this might be a crime scene, but they had no context, no missing persons reports that matched the scenario. Then, amidst the decaying fabric of one of the mattresses, an investigator noticed a glint of metal. He carefully retrieved the object, his gloved hands brushing away the filth. It was a small circular metal pendant attached to a faded, frayed red cord. The pendant was tarnished, but its unique design was still visible. The object was bagged and brought out into the daylight for closer inspection. It seemed like a minor piece of evidence, perhaps insignificant, but standard procedure required that any unique items found at a potential crime scene be cross-referenced with cold case files. The pendant was processed, and its description entered into the state's missing persons database. The search parameters were broad, looking for any unsolved disappearances involving similar items. The process was painstaking, requiring a review of hundreds of cold case files. The system returned a match. The pendant was a perfect match for an item described in a missing persons report filed 11 years earlier. The report detailed the disappearance of 2 brothers, Ethan and Isaac Abbott, in the Evergreen State Forest in July 1997. The report specifically mentioned that Isaac Abbott was wearing a unique circular pendant on a red cord when he vanished. A photograph included in the file, the same photograph taken by the scoutmaster on the day they disappeared, showed Isaac wearing the exact same pendant. The realization hit the investigative team like a physical blow. The buried container, the comic books, the mattresses. It all suddenly made a horrific kind of sense. They hadn't found a hunter's cache. They had found the place where the Abbott brothers had been taken. The discovery immediately transformed the investigation. This was no longer a local matter. The implications of a long-term abduction, potentially spanning years, required specialized resources and expertise. The county sheriff immediately contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The cold case of the vanished Boy Scouts had just burst wide open, revealing a darkness far greater than anyone had imagined. The discovery of the buried container deep within the Evergreen State Forest triggered an immediate and massive response. Within 24 hours, the remote logging site was transformed into a major crime scene investigation. FBI agents arrived, their dark blue jackets emblazoned with the bold yellow letters, FBI. Standing in stark contrast to the muted greens and browns of the forest, they secured the scene, establishing a strict perimeter and taking control of the investigation from the local authorities. The silence of the forest was replaced by the hum of generators and the crackle of radios. The Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, was consulted immediately. The nature of the discovery, a hidden underground bunker designed for long-term captivity, pointed toward a specific type of offender, one characterized by meticulous planning, patience, and a terrifying degree of organization. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a carefully orchestrated operation. The first priority was a detailed analysis of the site itself. The container was photographed extensively, both inside and out. The FBI agents walked along the top of the rusted structure, assessing its construction and the logistics of its placement. It was immediately clear that this was not a hastily constructed shelter or a temporary hiding place. It was a prison designed and built with chilling premeditation. The container had been modified significantly before being buried. Investigators discovered a sophisticated, custom-built ventilation system. This was the most striking feature, revealing the perpetrator's meticulous planning and technical expertise. It wasn't just a simple air pipe. It consisted of a complex network of buried ducts, specialized fans, and filters designed to circulate air while remaining concealed from the surface. The intake and exhaust vents were located hundreds of feet away from the container, hidden within a dense thicket of brush. The system was intricate, suggesting a high degree of technical skill and knowledge of HVAC systems. The hatch, the only entry and exit point, had been reinforced with heavy steel bars and secured with multiple locking mechanisms. These were not standard locks. They were custom-made restraints designed specifically to prevent escape from the inside. There was no way for anyone inside the container to open the hatch without specialized tools. The realization confirmed the horrific reality. Ethan and Isaac Abbott had not stumbled upon this place. They had been held captive here, buried alive in the darkness. The logistics of the operation were staggering. Burying a 40-foot shipping container in such a remote location required significant premeditation and the use of heavy equipment. Excavators, bulldozers, perhaps even a crane. It was not something that could be accomplished quickly or quietly. It implied that the perpetrator had access to the area and the means to operate heavy machinery without drawing suspicion. While the behavioral analysts worked on profiling the offender, the forensic teams began the painstaking process of searching the container for evidence. They hoped to find DNA, fingerprints, hair, or any trace evidence that could identify the perpetrator or confirm the presence of the victims beyond the pendant. The work was slow and grueling, conducted under the glare of portable lights, the air thick with the stench of decay, and the threat of biohazards. However, the environment inside the container proved to be a forensic nightmare. The years of moisture and grime, the fluctuating temperatures, and the pervasive rust and mold had degraded any potential biological evidence. The surfaces were covered in a thick layer of filth, making fingerprint recovery impossible. The mattresses and clothing remnants were so decayed that any DNA present had long since broken down. Despite the most advanced forensic techniques available in 2008, the site was forensically barren. The perpetrator had not only hidden the crime scene, time and nature had effectively sterilized it. The discovery of the container shattered the long-held theory that the Abbott brothers had died in an accident during the storm. The narrative of a tragic flood was replaced by a far more sinister reality. It was now undeniably an abduction case. The storm, which had been seen as the cause of their disappearance, was now viewed as a tragic coincidence. The chaos and confusion caused by the weather had likely aided the abductor, providing cover for the crime and erasing any potential tracks. The investigation shifted focus. If the boys were abducted, how did the perpetrator manage to transport them deep into the forest and bury them in a pre-prepared prison without being detected? The key lay in the logistics of the operation. The use of heavy machinery was the most promising lead. Investigators began researching the history of the specific tract of land where the container was found. Land records revealed that while the area was state-owned, it had been leased in the mid-1990s to a small, independent construction aggregate company. The company specialized in quarrying stone and gravel, operations that inherently involved the use of heavy equipment. This lease provided a plausible explanation for how someone might have had the access and the justification to operate excavators and bulldozers in the area without drawing immediate suspicion. The noise and disruption caused by the quarrying operation would have masked the noise and activity of burying the container. The perpetrator, authorities theorized, was likely connected to this company. The investigation now faced the daunting task of identifying and tracking down the individuals associated with the defunct operation, hoping to find a connection to the buried prison and the two boys who had been held captive within its rusted walls. The discovery of the aggregate company's lease on the land provided the investigation with its first concrete lead. The timeline matched. The company was active in the area in the mid-1990s, around the time the container must have been prepared and the boys disappeared. The logistics also aligned. The company had the heavy equipment necessary to bury a shipping container. The investigation pivoted sharply, focusing on identifying and tracking down anyone associated with the defunct operation. The company had gone out of business in the early 2000s, and the records were incomplete and disorganized. The task of compiling a list of former employees, contractors, and management was arduous, requiring investigators to track down scattered paperwork, tax records, and permits stored in dusty warehouses and private residences. The process took weeks, involving a team of analysts meticulously reconstructing the company's operations from fragmented data. As they dug deeper into the company's history, a murky picture began to emerge. Interviews with former employees and local residents revealed that the company had a reputation for cutting corners and operating on the fringes of legality. They were known for their disregard for environmental regulations, and there were persistent rumors that they used the leased state land for illegal dumping activities, burying hazardous materials to avoid disposal fees. The remote location and the lack of oversight provided the perfect cover for these illicit operations. This revelation led to the development of a compelling new theory. Perhaps the abduction was not the primary motive. Investigators hypothesized that the Abbott brothers, exploring the area near the cave, might have stumbled upon the illegal dumping operation in progress. The workers, fearing exposure, might have panicked and silenced the boys, using the shipping container, perhaps already on site for storing equipment or materials, as a temporary holding cell or even a makeshift tomb. This theory gained significant traction. It seemed a straightforward explanation for the involvement of heavy machinery and the presence of the container. It also aligned with the company's known shady practices. The motive shifted from predation to a crime cover-up. It seemed more plausible than the idea of a solitary predator orchestrating such an elaborate abduction scenario in the midst of an active mining operation. The investigation focused intensely on the company's foreman from 1997. He was identified as a man with a significant criminal record, including multiple charges of assault and battery. He was known for his volatile temper and his willingness to use intimidation to enforce his authority. Former employees described him as ruthless and unpredictable, a man capable of violence and motivated to protect the company's illegal activities. He seemed like the prime suspect. Locating the former foreman took several weeks. He had moved to another state, living a transient lifestyle, working odd jobs in construction. FBI agents tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. The confrontation was tense. The agents prepared for a hostile reaction. The interrogation was aggressive. The agents confronted him with the evidence of the buried container and the disappearance of the Abbott brothers. They pressured him about the company's activities in the evergreen forest, suggesting that the boys had seen something they weren't supposed to see. They painted a picture of a man desperate to protect his livelihood, willing to do anything to cover up his crimes. The former foreman was defiant and uncooperative at first, denying any knowledge of the container or the missing boys. He dismissed the allegations of illegal dumping as rumors spread by disgruntled former employees. But as the interrogation wore on and the agents hinted at potential federal charges for environmental crimes, his demeanor changed. He eventually admitted to the illegal dumping. He confessed that the company had routinely buried barrels of toxic waste on the leased land, saving millions in disposal costs. He even provided details about the locations of the burial sites, seemingly resigned to the legal consequences of these actions. However, when questioned about the Abbott brothers, he vehemently denied any involvement. He insisted that he had never seen the boys and had no knowledge of their disappearance. His denial seemed genuine, his frustration palpable. And critically, he provided a detailed, verifiable alibi for the day of the abduction. He claimed he was attending an equipment auction in a neighboring county several hours away from the evergreen forest. Investigators were skeptical. The coincidence seemed too convenient. They meticulously checked his alibi, pulling financial transaction records, hotel receipts, and interviewing witnesses from the auction. The evidence was conclusive. The alibi held up. Financial transaction records, including receipts from the auction and gas station purchases, confirmed his presence at the auction. Witnesses at the auction also corroborated his story. The timeline was tight, making it virtually impossible for him to have been involved in the abduction. The former foreman was cleared of involvement in the disappearance of the Abbott brothers. The collapse of the aggregate company theory was a significant setback. The investigation was back to square one with a buried prison, 2 missing boys, and no viable suspects. The frustration among the investigative team was immense. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit urged the investigators to refocus on the evidence found inside the container. The BAU emphasized that the nature of the items found, the mattresses, the CD player, the comic books, the long-term supply of food wrappers, suggested a captivity scenario with a caretaker dynamic. This was fundamentally inconsistent with a quick crime cover-up motive. If the boys had been killed to silence them, the perpetrators would likely have disposed of the bodies quickly and discreetly. They would not have set up a long-term living space, providing food, entertainment, and bedding. The evidence pointed toward a solitary abductor, a predator who had planned the abduction meticulously and intended to keep the boys captive for an extended period. The aggregate company's activity in the forest was not the source of the crime, but rather the cover. The perpetrator had likely used the noise, disruption, and presence of heavy machinery to conceal his own activities. The investigation shifted back toward identifying this solitary abductor, a shadow figure who had operated undetected within the chaos of the quarrying operation. The question remained: who had the access, the skills, and the motive to commit such a horrific crime? The investigation now focused on the periphery, looking for the anomaly that would lead them to the truth. With the aggregate company theory dismissed and traditional investigative avenues exhausted, the investigation stalled once again. The lack of forensic evidence inside the container made identifying the perpetrator seem almost impossible. The investigators were left with the container itself, a rusting enigma buried in the forest floor. They decided to return to the physical evidence, focusing specifically on the unique, sophisticated modifications made to the container. The key to identifying the perpetrator lay in understanding how the container was constructed and buried. The ventilation system was the most distinctive feature. It was not a standard, off-the-shelf solution. It was a custom-built system designed to provide adequate airflow to the buried container while remaining hidden from the surface. It utilized specific high-grade industrial components, specialized inline fans, HEPA filters, and heavy-duty ductwork not typically available to the general public or standard construction workers. These components were specialized, designed for industrial applications requiring high reliability and durability. They were the kind of components used in specialized HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems in commercial buildings, hospitals, or industrial facilities. This indicated that the perpetrator had specialized knowledge and access to specialized equipment. Investigators hypothesized that the perpetrator must have had specialized knowledge and access to these components. They decided to trace the origin of the ventilation parts, hoping to identify the purchaser. They contacted the manufacturer of the specialized fans and filters identified by the serial numbers still visible on the components. The manufacturer, recognizing the gravity of the investigation, cooperated fully, providing a list of regional distributors who sold these specific components in the mid-1990s. The task of tracing the sales records from over a decade earlier was daunting. Many of the distributors had gone out of business or had purged their old records. However, one distributor, a large industrial supply company, still maintained archived sales records. The records were stored on microfilm, requiring painstaking manual review. The process took weeks, involving a team of analysts meticulously reviewing thousands of transactions. Investigators focused on cash sales or small orders, transactions that might not be easily traceable to a specific company or individual. They were looking for anyone who purchased these specialized components in the period leading up to the Abbott brothers' disappearance. They were searching for a needle in a haystack, hoping for a breakthrough in the mountain of data. The search yielded hundreds of transactions. The investigators then began the painstaking process of cross-referencing the sales records with individuals known to have access to the evergreen forest area, but who were not direct employees of the aggregate company. They were looking for someone who operated on the periphery, someone who might have gone unnoticed. A match was found. A cash transaction for 2 specialized inline fans and several HEPA filters dated March 1997, 4 months before the abduction. The purchaser had provided a name, but no company affiliation. The name was Arthur Barnes. Investigators ran a background check on Arthur Barnes. The results were immediate and alarming. Arthur was a solitary HVAC specialist. He operated his own small business specializing in the installation and maintenance of complex HVAC systems. He had the specialized knowledge and skills required to design and build the ventilation system found in the container. Furthermore, Arthur was connected to the evergreen forest area. He worked as a subcontractor, occasionally hired by the aggregate company for specialized maintenance on their heavy equipment's climate control systems. This provided him with legitimate access to the area and the knowledge of the company's operations. He was also contracted by the state to service remote utility stations near the forest. This provided him with even broader access to the area, including the knowledge of the terrain and the ability to operate unnoticed. His utility truck, laden with equipment and supplies, could move in and out of the wilderness without drawing attention. He was a ghost moving through the forest unnoticed. But it was the deeper background check that solidified Arthur as the prime suspect. Investigators discovered that he had briefly volunteered with a different Boy Scout troop in the early 1990s. He had served as an assistant scoutmaster for less than a year. The records were vague, but interviews with the troop leaders revealed a troubling history. Arthur had been quietly asked to leave the troop due to unspecified boundary issues and inappropriate attention toward the children. The troop leaders spoke of incidents where Arthur seemed overly focused on certain boys, offering them private lessons and gifts, and making them uncomfortable. There were allegations of favoritism, inappropriate physical contact, and obsessive behavior towards certain boys. No formal charges were ever filed, but the concerns were serious enough to warrant his removal. The profile matched the behavioral analyst's predictions. A solitary, meticulous planner with specialized skills, access to the location, and a disturbing history of predatory behavior toward young boys, indicators of pedophilia. The evidence was circumstantial, but the specificity of the ventilation components combined with Arthur's background and access made him the most compelling suspect the investigation had identified. The focus shifted entirely to Arthur Barnes. The shadow figure finally had a name. The investigation now shifted towards locating Arthur Barnes and confronting him with the evidence, hoping to finally uncover the truth about what happened to the two Boy Scouts who vanished in the storm. The investigation moved quickly. Authorities located Arthur Barnes, now in his late 50s, still living in a nearby county. He resided in a small, isolated house on the outskirts of town, maintaining the reclusive lifestyle that had characterized his past. He was still working in the HVAC industry, operating his small business from a workshop attached to his home. The FBI placed Arthur under surveillance, monitoring his movements and activities. He appeared to be a man of routine, predictable, and unremarkable. They observed his movements, noting his solitary routines and his meticulous attention to detail in his work. He interacted with very few people, mostly clients and suppliers. He seemed unremarkable, invisible, but the surveillance confirmed that he still possessed the technical skills and the access to specialized equipment that had been used in the construction of the buried prison. Based on the highly specific circumstantial evidence linking him to the container's specialized parts, his access to the site, and his disturbing history with the Boy Scouts, the FBI secured a search warrant for Arthur's property. They decided to execute the warrant early in the morning, hoping to catch him off guard. The raid was swift and decisive. A tactical team descended on Arthur's property, securing the house and the workshop. They moved swiftly, breaching the door and securing the premises. They found Arthur inside the house, seemingly preparing for his workday. He appeared startled and confused by the sudden arrival of the agents, but he did not resist arrest. He remained silent as he was handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol car. The search of the property began immediately. The house was neat and organized, reflecting Arthur's meticulous nature. Investigators searched every room, looking for any evidence linking him to the Abbott brothers or the buried container. They did not find the typical trophies often associated with serial predators. No photographs, no stolen belongings, no souvenirs of the crime. But in the workshop, amidst the tools and equipment of his trade, they found something far more incriminating. The workshop was meticulously organized, every tool in its place, reflecting Arthur's obsessive attention to detail. In a locked filing cabinet hidden among legitimate business records, they uncovered a set of detailed architectural drawings and schematics. The drawings depicted a buried shipping container, complete with the complex ventilation system found at the crime scene. The specifications matched the container's unique construction precisely. The level of detail was staggering, including precise measurements, materials lists, and installation instructions. It was a blueprint for a prison. The discovery of the schematics was the smoking gun. It was irrefutable proof that Arthur had designed and built the buried prison. Further search of the workshop revealed more incriminating evidence. They found receipts for the rental of heavy equipment, an excavator and a bulldozer, dated March 1997, the same month he purchased the specialized ventilation components. The rental company was located in a neighboring county, suggesting he had deliberately avoided local suppliers to minimize the risk of detection. The rental agreement listed Arthur as the operator, confirming his ability to transport and bury the container independently. In a dusty box hidden in the attic of the workshop, they found the most disturbing evidence of all: a collection of unsent letters, dozens of them, written over a period of several years. The letters were obsessive and delusional, addressed to E and I. They detailed a bizarre, twisted fantasy of a shared life, a hidden family living in an underground sanctuary. The letters revealed a deeply disturbed mind obsessed with control and possession. They chronicled the daily routines within the container, the psychological manipulation employed by Arthur, and his attempts to create a twisted version of a family dynamic. But Ethan, the older brother, never acquiesced. He constantly fought back, resisting Arthur's control and attempting multiple escapes. He encouraged Isaac to resist as well, maintaining a fierce determination to survive. Ethan's defiance enraged Arthur, leading to escalating confrontations. Several months into the captivity, during a violent confrontation inside the container, Arthur killed Ethan. He admitted to strangling him in a fit of rage after Ethan had managed to damage the ventilation system in an escape attempt. The confession was chilling in its detachment. Arthur described the murder with the same meticulous detail he used to describe the construction of the container. The investigators pressed him about the location of Ethan's body. They needed to recover the remains to provide the Abbott family with some measure of closure. Under pressure, Arthur agreed to lead them to the burial site. He directed the investigators to a separate location in the evergreen forest, several miles from the container. It was a remote area characterized by dense underbrush and rocky terrain. He pointed to a spot beneath a large oak tree. The excavation began immediately. The investigators dug carefully, their movements precise and deliberate. After several hours of digging, the investigators uncovered human remains. The remains were skeletal, consistent with a body buried for over a decade. Forensic analysis later confirmed the identity of the remains. Ethan Abbott had finally been found. The discovery was heartbreaking, but it provided the confirmation that the Abbott family had been desperately seeking. The investigation had achieved a partial victory, but the fate of the younger brother, Isaac, remained unknown. The recovery of Ethan's remains brought a measure of closure to the Abbott family, confirming their worst fears, but ending the agonizing uncertainty about his fate. However, the fate of the younger brother, Isaac, remained an agonizing mystery. When investigators pressed Arthur Barnes about what happened to Isaac, his detailed and detached confession suddenly became evasive and contradictory. Arthur claimed that after Ethan's death, Isaac became completely withdrawn and unresponsive, his spirit broken. He insisted that several years later, around 2001, Isaac managed to escape. According to Arthur, he had returned to the container to restock supplies and found the hatch open and Isaac gone. He claimed that Isaac had somehow managed to force open the reinforced locks, a feat that seemed highly improbable given the construction of the hatch and Isaac's age and physical condition after years of captivity. Arthur insisted that he searched the surrounding area, but found no trace of Isaac. He claimed he then abandoned the container entirely, fearing that Isaac would lead the authorities to him. Investigators strongly doubted Arthur's account. The story of Isaac's escape seemed self-serving and inconsistent with the meticulous control Arthur had exerted over every aspect of the captivity. Authorities believe that Arthur murdered Isaac as well, perhaps when he became too old to control, or perhaps in the immediate aftermath of Ethan's death. They suspected that Arthur refused to disclose the location of Isaac's body as a final measure of control, a way to maintain power over the investigation and the victim's family, or perhaps because he genuinely could not remember the exact location of the burial site after so many years. Furthermore, investigators believed that Arthur's claim of fully abandoning the container was not the entire truth. The meticulous design and construction of the buried prison suggested a long-term plan. a permanent fixture designed for repeated use. Authorities speculated that Arthur likely kept the container maintained over the years, toying with the thought of more victims, waiting for the opportunity to strike again. The discovery of the container by the loggers had likely thwarted his future plans. Arthur Barnes was charged with the kidnapping and murder of Ethan Abbott and the kidnapping of Isaac Abbott. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, the schematics, the receipts, the confession, and the recovery of Ethan's remains, he pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The recovery of Ethan's remains provided the Abbott family with confirmation of his fate, allowing them to finally lay him to rest. However, because Isaac's body was never found, and Arthur refused to admit to his murder, the ultimate fate of the younger brother remains officially unresolved. The silence of the evergreen forest holds the final secret of the vanished Boy Scouts.